welcome everyone. We're just going to give it another couple of minutes to allow some kind of late people to kind of come in. In the meantime, we've got a couple of questions that we would be very appreciative if you could answer them, and link to the response form should be in the chat now.
Ready to get started, Leo?
Yep. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining. For those of you who don't know who PowerOn are, we are a kind of managed services provider, professional services, support services, kind of specialising in the kind of Microsoft stack and technologies. We are UK based, but have kind of a global reach. And I am Leah Darcy. I'm the Head of Identity and Access here at PowerOn Platforms, and I'm also the creator of the AOVPN DPC tool that we're here today to talk about. And I'm very pleased to be joined by the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Richard Hicks, the guy who has literally written the book on AOVPN. Welcome and thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Leo. I appreciate it. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Richard Hicks, founder and principal consultant at Richard M. Hicks Consulting, US-based consulting focusing on enterprise mobility and security infrastructure. I do a lot of work with enterprise secure remote access, certificate services, and PKI. Also, I'm going to put in a plug for a new piece of material I produced. I just released yesterday a new Always On VPN video training course on Pluralsight. Would encourage you to check that out. The course clocked in at nearly 7 hours. So there is plenty of content in this video training course for you. You will love it. You will learn quite a bit. That is, you can learn more. Go to richardhicks.com/pluralsight. But I'm really excited to be here today, Leo, with you, and share with the folks a little bit about Always On VPN DPC and managing, VPN client configuration settings using Active Directory and group policy.
Lovely. And I'm always curious, how did you kind of get started in the whole kind of Microsoft remote access technology?
Good question. In my earliest days in IT, I was I had a really heavy networking focus. I guess I took to networking, really liked it, was working with networking-based technologies like Microsoft proxy server back in the day, dating myself, of course. This is probably mid-90s or so. Pivoted on to some of the Microsoft security solutions like Microsoft ISA Server, Forefront TMG. Also, I used to work for many years, I worked for a large US-based financial services institution where I managed secure internet access and business partner connectivity. And that's what kind of exposed me to site-side VPN, client-based VPN, clientless VPN or SSL VPN as it was back in the day. I went to work for a Microsoft partner and got involved with direct access, mostly because the people who were looking after direct access at this particular company were more application focused than network focused. And so I kind of took over that. Really loved the technology. I really dug it in that it was fantastic. And then, of course, as Microsoft has kind of pivoted to always on VPN, I picked up that solution too. At the end of the day, always on VPN is everything direct access provides and more. It just does so in a fundamentally different way, but principally speaking, same user experience, a little different administrative experience, but overall fantastic solution. So here I am today.
Great stuff. Great to hear.
Mm.
So just to kind of let you know what we're going to be doing, we're going to give people a quick overview of DPC, what it is, how it came to be, etc. Then we're going to talk about kind of the new interesting features from version 3 that is very soon to be released. Then we'll talk through some of the kind of advanced features that you can kind of only really do with a tool such as DPC, both in the existing version and in V3 as well. And then we're going to be kind of finishing off with an open Q&A. So please do get your questions in the chat, and we'll try and pick out some interesting ones and answer them.
Excellent. Sounds good.
So, so what is DPC? Well, ultimately, we had an issue, or we've been deploying AOVPN for a number of years, and one of the issues that we saw pretty much with every customer that we were dealing with was we've just come from direct access, or we've come from other VPN client solutions, and the management of DPC, of AOVPN is a nightmare, and we really don't like it. What do you mean we've got to kind of manage our own XML files, and this is a really weird error, and oh dear, I've just typoed this this thumbprint. Or
make sure absolutely every letter on and character on that XML file is perfect. And
sometimes case sensitive.
In the right case at times, like where did that come from? No, and then of course it has to, even if you get everything right, it's got to be in the right order. It's got to be nested perfectly. Yeah, it's tedious and time consuming, no question.
And so we started automating some of it with PowerShell, and we kind of went, well, what kind of where can we go next kind of thing, and that's where ultimately DPC came from. So ultimately DPC is a Windows service that runs on your client devices, and it takes its configuration from group policy. So you can configure all of your settings in group policy, that gets replicated down to the clients, and then the clients dynamically build out the XML configurations onto the client device itself. And that allows us to do some quite unique things with it at times, which we'll kind of discuss later on. So from what does this look like? Well, anyone who's kind of familiar with group policy ultimately should be kind of roughly familiar with the screenshot you're seeing in front of you here. So this is kind of the high level settings of, do you want a user tunnel, do you want a device tunnel, a couple of the other major kind of system level settings. You've then got kind of all of your unique settings for, in this case, this is configuring the user tunnel. So everything from your allowed route lists to your VPN endpoint, etc. We then have some much more advanced features, things like custom cryptography, route metrics, and you'll start to see here, there's some settings in here that you literally can't configure through the XML. Things like the actual tunnel metrics, setting the VPN protocols correctly, things like that. And that's because of some of the things that we do behind the scenes to enable that to happen. And then one of the new things in version 3 is actually the ability to configure traffic filters on each of the tunnels. So that was a specific request from a couple of people. So we've been able to iterate it and get that in, which is really exciting. And ultimately, each of these configuration settings has one or more settings, but what we've also tried to do is improve the user experience for the customers trying to deploy it. So as much as Richard tries to document absolutely everything on his blog, I'd say far better than some of the official documentation at times. That is ultimately, you've got a random XML file and you've got to go searching on someone's website for that, and that's not always the easiest or the most intuitive approach to deploying technology. So we try to make use of the capabilities that group policy has to be able to provide the relevant and timely information with the settings that you're configuring, so that you are both informed and educated as to what you're configuring and why. And ultimately, DPC is a Windows service, so there's no kind of user interface as such, but it is fully configured to work with kind of the event tracing for Windows framework. And it ultimately does have the output of a VPN tunnel, just like any other kind of AOVPN configuration and connection. So, kind of Richard, how did you kind of get involved with, or what kind of drew you to the product as such?
Excellent question. And one of the things that really drew me to this is that the scenarios in which a customer, an opportunity would come up, a customer would want to deploy always on VPN. They had direct access, right? And you know, they're not using Intune, right? So this is an organization who may not have started their journey to you know, cloud management. They may not be starting it. They're happy, you know, they're you know, small mid-sized organization. They, you know, predominantly on premises. Already existing investments in Active Directory, using group policy to manage all their endpoints today anyway, and they don't see any real pressing needs to move to Azure and Intune because they just don't have those requirements. And this was really lacking feature parity with direct access. Administrators love the fact that direct access really is kind of point, click, and ship. When you open the direct access or the remote access management console to manage direct access, that really is a group policy configuration wizard. Everything you do in there is just pushing those settings into group policy. And then administration is dirt simple, right? Group policy has been around since the beginning of time. Even the most junior administrators should be familiar with this model. It is mature, it's robust, it's stable, and you know, you put a device into a group and they get the settings and they can go out into the world and connect. And a lot of organizations are looking for that kind of feature parity with direct access. And the way I had been doing it prior to DPC was PowerShell script launched via startup scripts. The challenge with that is that it works great to push it out. It doesn't give you anything to manage it, right? So if you ever need to make changes, then you have to write an additional Power script and push that out with Power, you know, with a startup script or something like that. So it can be done. It's just very laborious. It's also a heavy administrative lift, right? So you have to write the PowerShell scripts. I certainly can provide you with some samples, but ultimately you'd have to write those in your organization. You have to do some sort of versioning. You have to know, does this new profile that's on this machine have the correct settings? If yes, great. If not, I have to remove it and reinstall it. And by the way, when you remove it, you have to, you know, if you're running this as a startup script, you're going to have to be connected to the domain. What do you do with those users in the field? There's all sorts of problems with it, and that's why I was so intrigued when I was, you know, first introduced to DPC, is that it really kind of filled this gap that was sorely missing for organizations who haven't yet transferred to Intune, and ultimately I see that, you know, there's possibilities for using DPC post Intune as well. So we might want to have a discussion about that later in the webinar today too.
Yeah, So just kind of, I always find it interesting to kind of draw this out and kind of show people kind of where the kind of the power on DPC element is versus kind of doing it yourself and versus Intune. And while Intune in theory, there's a lot of kind of microcontrols elements, there's certainly more than a few caveats on things like settings validation and profile generation, because sometimes they're just plain wrong, and
Correct.
sometimes they just they don't have all the options, or because ultimately they are doing the XML generation at the server side and just pushing the XML down onto the client.
And that brings up an excellent point. Also, is that the Intune management interface is somewhat limited, right? So you can deploy a base VPN profile, but there's tons of features that Always On VPN supports that are not exposed in Intune, and further not exposed in XML. I mean, I find myself for most deployments using Intune, using custom XML because it gives me more fine-grained control over the configuration parameters, also exposes some additional settings that are not available in the Intune UI. But ultimately, there's always post-deployment configuration required to kind of fine-tune and optimize the configuration that's not in Intune or in XML. And so you have to, get creative and use other things. And I love the fact that we've been able to kind of build in a lot of those kind of settings that are common settings that have to be tweaked after the profile is implemented to ensure consistent and reliable operation. And I love the fact that we've done a good job of making sure that all of those pain points have been addressed in one user interface. I love it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us on to kind of DPC v3 really, and we've taken a lot of feedback over the past must be over a year now since we kind of did the initial kind of the initial releases or public releases of DPC, and yeah, we've done a whole bunch of work, and even then we've kind of made this kind of new kind of version 3. Is there anything kind of that really kind of stands out to you in terms of the kind of favorite feature?
So yes, there's a lot of them, trust me. I love the fact that we can adjust things like VPN tunnel interface metrics. We can adjust things like VPN strategy settings. We can very easily choose our custom cryptography settings. There are a whole host of things. Certainly, the new features in version 3 with traffic filtering are going to help as customers kind of journey towards implementing zero trust network access or ZTNA, because that's going to be really helpful. However, I think one of the most compelling features on this is the dynamic Office 365 exclusion. So I think you're going to talk about that here shortly, correct?
Yeah, that's actually been something that we baked into the original version, which was really quite out there at the time, but
for certain,
we effectively built something like that originally in our PowerShell script, but even then you still had to run it every week, and that's still a pain and then you still have those issues that you were talking about there of, okay, you've got different versions of this thing, how do you get that up to date on a customer's environment?
And by the way, I have seen some hellaciously complex PowerShell scripts that customers have developed and I've assisted with at times. And I just look at this and I go, man, this is just so painful. And then the first time I saw your solution, I was like, this is the answer. Just do it in group policy. You make a change in group policy, standard group policy refresh will handle the update. You handle the endpoint, configuration. And correct me if I'm wrong, these can be done over the air, right? So you can actually update group policy, which would affect Always On VPN client configuration settings, but you can do that remotely. So no need to be connected to the office physically, correct?
Yeah, you obviously need to be connected to get the GP update, and then the next time it runs, it will try and do the policy deployment, and then it won't kick you off the network to avoid any, or it won't do it if you are connected to a VPN. It will hold the update until the VPN drops, so that you don't have any kind of user disruption, and then as soon as it drops, it will inject the new profile, and then you're good to go. So even a basic network blip will allow you to kind of update to the
Good deal.
latest version.
Outstanding. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So in terms of the one that I think I've failed, I think the backup tunnel for me is the most interesting one from my perspective, because while it's not the sexiest of features by any stretch, it does offer a whole range of options, both for customers that are looking for kind of just they want two different profiles for various configurations, but it also offers options around doing things like active passive DR without the hassle of kind of global DNS features.
Yeah, good point. Yeah,
and some other capabilities around that.
And there's always that scenario where, you know, somebody makes a configuration change or causes a problem that is going to be problematic, and now you've kind of, you know, borked your configuration. Having that backup tunnel there is really nice, because from an administrative perspective, it allows you to kind of establish that connectivity so that you can, you know, at least temporarily authenticate, update group policy, and fix your problems. And I definitely see that as being tremendously helpful, especially in those scenarios where you absolutely need it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as it becomes, like anything, as it becomes easier to modify things, the people tend to modify things more, and well, it's that whole the longer the curve, the more you do it, the chance of you breaking it at some point for some reason does go up.
For sure.
So yeah, in fact, you were kind of talking or kind of alluding to this not so long ago on the whole being able to do kind of forced tunnel exclusions in kind of a more kind of, don't want to say sane way, but a more dynamic way, shall we say, than is available from XML. So obviously we expose the capability, like the baseline capability of here's some IP addresses and the exclusions for that, and we do actually also offer the ability to put your comments in against it, so you can kind of track what those are for kind of ongoing maintenance purposes. But then we take it that one step further, as you were mentioning, and we can take those that whole range of exclusions that Microsoft publish. We have a direct integration with the Microsoft endpoint API, so that if they have the appropriate network access, the clients will dynamically go and pick up these settings every time they do an update, and they also cache them so that if you don't have network access, it will kind of solve that, or it will fall back to the last version that it had access to, and it will then dynamically inject all of those into the profile, and that's the setting there. It's a simple, do you want it configured, yes, no option, and DPC kind of takes care of the rest of it, which is there's a lot of complexity behind that, but any good tool, in my opinion, it's a lot of swimming under the surface and a nice serene single tick box button at the front.
You bet.
And then we were kind of showing this to some customers, and they went, "That's great, Leo, but now I want to do Zoom, and I want this service and that service." And was one of those of, well, do we go down that? Do we kind of develop one of these API integrations for every single service that a customer wants? And that just didn't really seem scalable to us, because then you've also got to maintain them and manage them moving forward, etc. So what we've done is we've actually created a kind of proof of concept script that customers can use, leveraging actually the original exclusion baseline. And again, because it's just group policy, we can just use PowerShell and group policy management commandlets. So the script that we've got kind of a sample of here, and there's obviously more to it, and if anyone needs it, then do reach out to us. But ultimately what this script does is it reads either from a file location or straight off the web. So in this example, we're pulling the Zoom list. It takes that list of prefixes and it goes and automatically injects them into the exclusion routes within your group policy so that they can be kind of automatically deployed out. And then you can either run this manually once a month, etc., or you could schedule it for more regular updates, or ultimately, because it is just a PowerShell script, you can do what you like with it.
Very good. And this is run by an administrator on somewhere with it does not on the endpoint. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Correct. Yes. This is on the server side. It pushes
it
in. It pushes it into the group policy, and then the group policy gets kind of pushed out.
Outstanding. Fantastic.
And you're able to kind of take us through some of these settings, because a lot they're quite interesting, but not people don't necessarily understand all of them and kind of what they do and why you need them.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd be happy to show just a couple of these off here. These are some of the settings that I've had to implement changes for customers quite a few times here. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here, and let me actually first I better share. Do I have the ability to share?
You should do.
You want to share? Yes, I want to share. And we should be able to then see the meeting, and I should be looking at my client workstation. Let me find my management workstation here. Very good. Okay, so we are on my management workstation. Let me open up my group policy management console. Oh, cool. I did have it open. I was thinking, I should have done this before. Oh no, so it's actually edited here. So this is the group policy management console, and of course we're editing a GPO. And if we take a look at some of these capabilities, like as we alluded to before, when you do your initial configuration, there's kind of the base settings here. Do I want to enable the device tunnel and user tunnel? And then you'll go into the individual nodes here and say, these are the settings for my device tunnels and user tunnels. And again, as we've demonstrated or we pointed out, there's a lot of the kind of the baseline capabilities, but then you also have these advanced capabilities. And so one of the most common settings that we'll make here is enabling custom cryptography. And this allows you to just basically enable this, and there's a nice drop-down list for you to choose all of these settings. The thing here that this saves you the pain on is that, of course, from a drop-down setting, you can just simply select all of your settings. You need to ensure that the server side matches, of course, but ultimately this saves a lot of pain. And probably one of the biggest pain points, and I believe, Leo, you might have even tripped up on this in initial testing, is that this syntax, if you look at the syntax, this just cracks me up, is this GCM ACS 128, but here it is listed as AES _ GCM _ 128. The only reason anybody would know this is if you were absolutely looking at every word in the VPN CSP documentation on Microsoft, or you just tripped over this landmine like I did initially, and then you realize that that happens. So that's helpful.
I think that the PowerShell uses slightly different ones to the actual CSP. I think that's where I got tripped up on.
Yeah, but, I quite clearly the folks at Microsoft, they have some different groups that are managing those pieces and not talking to each other. Can't imagine why they chose that different syntax for that one specific setting. So custom cryptography is great. Tunnel metrics. So tunnel metrics are really critical in some cases, and let me describe why you would want to change the tunnel metric on an always on VPN tunnel interface. It has to do with name resolution. By default, Windows sends DNS queries to all active interfaces to the first IP address, or excuse me, the first DNS server of each active interface on the system, and it goes out to all of them. And if it gets more than one response back, it prioritizes it by the interface metric. Interface metrics are assigned dynamically, and they are assigned by the operating system based on interface speed. The scenario that presents itself most commonly is when you have an endpoint that's configured for always on VPN, and it's connected to the internet via a wired Ethernet connection. So either cabled directly into the cable modem with a Cat5 cable, or perhaps it's docked in a docking station that has a wired Ethernet connection. And in that scenario, you could get unexpected DNS responses or unexpected results with failed responses, or sometimes incorrect IP addresses. And that has to do with the interface metric, because the DNS query comes back from the VPN interface, but it also gets something back from that wired Ethernet connection, and it prefers the Ethernet connection. So the name resolution request fails. So here the answer is to simply lower the interface metric of the VPN interface, or the VPN tunnel, so that it is lower than anything else on the system, and it works reliably. The challenge here is that this is not exposed in the Intune UI. It is not exposed in XML. You must change this setting in the rasphone.pbk INI file or INF file, which is not terribly difficult, but doing it at scale is problematic, right? So once again, you would write a PowerShell script and you'd have to push this out and deal with that. Here, it's just an advanced setting. We just enable the settings, set our interface metric to whatever we want. I usually set mine to 3. That works reliably, and that ensures that my DNS queries are always going to return from the VPN tunnel adapter, which is exactly what we're looking for. So yeah, there's tons of settings in here. Those are some of my favorites. One of the other one is here's network outage time. I'll describe this one just a bit. I get asked about this one all the time. What is this, and why do we want to do this? The challenge here is that centered around IKE v2 specifically. So with IKE v2, by default, something called IKE mobility is enabled, and IKE mobility is designed to provide connection resilience, meaning if there's a loss of underlying connectivity, the always-on VPN connection using IKE v2 will not immediately drop, and when connectivity is restored, it will automatically try to resume that same session. The problem lies within scenarios where we have load balanced clusters and a node goes offline and our connection is bounced to another server by the load balancer. I was connected to node number 1, and now when I switch over to node number 2 because node number 1 failed or came offline for servicing or maintenance or what have you, the client, when IKE mobility is enabled, will say, hey, VPN server, I want to resume this session. And the VPN server says, I don't know anything about, I don't know who you are. I don't know what the session this is. And then they stop talking to each other. So basically, during a failover event, it could be 15 to 30 minutes, even longer, for that tunnel to resume. Now, for us, a device tunnel, probably not the end of the way. Maybe nobody's even going to notice it. But if you're using IKE v2 for the user tunnel, it's going to be hugely problematic. And so the answer to that is to either reduce the network outage time, or, as I recommend, simply disable it altogether. And you're just disabling IKE mobility. And in this scenario, what it does is it ensures more reliable and consistent and more responsive failover for load balance systems when you have IKE v2 as the VPN protocol.
Lovely, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
I can use Teams on this.
There we go.
There we go. So one of the things that we've kind of worked really hard on, and some of the great best feedback that we've had, especially through things like our case study with Telford and Wrekin Council here in the UK, is around the great ability to do kind of backup and recovery using kind of DPC to kind of leverage that. Ultimately, at the simplest level, if your client does have a problem for one reason or another, if you're kind of using traditional tooling, you've then got to get some PowerShell scripts, probably taken from Mr. Hicks's website, in some variety or other. You're going to have to get PS exec so you can elevate into system. You've got to run all of this stuff, and on a client device, especially if it's locked down from a kind of command prompt perspective, or kind of you've applied a basic level of security to your devices, that's just nightmare, especially if you're trying to do it remotely and the VPN's down. Some of those can really be a problem. What Telford actually found was that because DPC operates off of just registry keys and group policy in the registry. You can actually kind of do a complete reset of your profiles using a batch script just to inject your registry settings in, restart the service, and kind of that brings your device back up to a level where you can then pull back from group policy correctly.
And and Leo, just to clarify that's on the endpoint, correct? So you have an endpoint that is somehow borked and it's not connecting. So you can actually, so that's good for a help desk administrator to be able to restore connectivity for a user that might be broken.
Yeah, or if you kind of really in a kind of a failure DLF scenario, and suddenly you've got you've had to use a different URL or something, and none of your clients are connecting anymore. I don't think I've heard of anyone actually having to do that, but I've certainly had that scenario kind of tabletopped, and in a kind of traditional environment. I mean, with Intune, it's not too bad because you can just push it, provided you've got internet connectivity. It's fine. You can just publish it that way. In a kind of Active Directory or PowerShell-based environment, that's an absolute nightmare scenario for a lot of administrators. So being able to provide that, hey, it's going to be bad, but it's not going to be that bad, is a weight off of a lot of people's minds. The other thing that you can do is, again, leveraging those great capabilities of group policy, you can do piloting. So rather than publishing out your configuration to all 5,000 devices on day one, you might want to consider having a pilot group of, say, maybe 5, 10, 50 users that and then you can just configure all of your group policy inheritance, your security grouping, all of that stuff, just to make the changes to that pilot group first, check that nothing's gone wrong. They then got the backup tunnel if they need to get back in, and ultimately then make those changes either by making the same changes again to another policy, or just changing around your security groups on your group policy to do a wider rollout. And then ultimately, as I've already kind of mentioned a few times, we've got that backup tunnel, which can be completely independently configured, either via separate policies or configurations. And then it's not always on, but a user then has that option to go into the network configuration, select that backup tunnel, and then they can get back in either using exactly the same settings as your previous set, or you could have either a separate site or a separate URL, separate configuration. Some customers, for example, have IKV2 on the primary and SSTP on the backup, things like that, depending on the customer's kind of requirements ultimately.
Good.
And that kind of brings us to the end. Does anyone have any questions for either of us? Please feel free to add them into the chat, and we'll try and get hold of them or try and answer them.
Very good.
So we've got one question in for: would a batch script just be deployed at launch of DPC for later use? So ultimately, how the batch script scenario is what Telford especially were using it for. Their kind of first line support guys, they had a batch script, so they'd call up the user who was having an issue, say, hey, kind of let me log in via TeamViewer or something. They'd run this script, and that would kind of reset the tunnels so that they had access to it. Theoretically, you could have you could publish that batch script out to all of your users in kind of advance in terms of that preemptive scenario, so that you could hide it somewhere and then just call up the user and say, hey, go double click this file under C backup fixvpn.bat or something like that if you wanted to. Ultimately, there's no direct capabilities within DPC to create a batch file like that, but there's no reason ultimately what you're dealing with DPC is a series of registry settings. So we advise that you use the group policy and ADMX for managing and monitoring those, just because it's a great bit of technology that's been robustly configured and battle tested over multiple decades. But ultimately, you could just go and modify those registry settings in any way that you want to modify registry settings.
Good to hear. Very good. Any other questions at all? And by the way, we're here. We're happy to answer any questions, even if it's not DPC related. You have our time. If you just have basic, always on VPN operational questions, I'm happy to answer those too. So
absolutely,
we're here and available. Operators are standing by.
So we've got another one. Can different tunnels be used for different access depending on whether the user is needing to connect with their admin account or their standard user account without changing desktops?
Ooh, good question.
Yes. So the classic consultant answer of yes and no.
Or it depends. Yeah.
It depends. Ultimately, DPC operates in the system context. So any profiles deployed are purely or are machine level rather than on a per user basis.
Mm. And I think I get where he's going with this. In other words, under normal circumstances, you would want a user to log in and authenticate and have a certain level of access.
Yeah.
But you may want to elevate that access under certain conditions, right? Much like we do with regular UIC, right, and so forth. I think the challenge with that is, and this is really a fundamental limitation of the always on VPN technology, is that any security or access controls that we put in place in the VPN configuration profile are kind of static, right? Obviously, the folks here at PowerOn have done some fantastic stuff with being able to do some dynamic updates of the, of some of the settings. Office 365 exclusions is a perfect example, right? But ultimately, what they're doing behind the scenes is building the configuration and installing it. But once it's installed, it's kind of locked. And so any traffic filters that you have, any access permission, any routes defined would be in that profile. And I don't know that there's any good way, even with even with or without DPC, this is a limitation of always on VPN and how it's implemented on the endpoint. It is just doesn't lend itself well to making those kind of on the fly or dynamic access changes. So unfortunately, this is just a limitation of the technology.
The other thing that I always kind of come back to when customers start talking about, we want different users to have different levels of access and things, is ultimately if you're going to do it on the client configuration, that means you are inherently trusting a potentially dirty device.
Potentially, yes.
And the old adage of never trust a client, and that's client as in computer, not a
right, exactly,
not a customer.
You're absolutely right. I think traffic filters are a little more positive. Certainly, controlling access by routes is a bit of security theater, because even though we don't add those routes, somebody with administrative access could easily add them and then route over the tunnel. For most of my large enterprise deployments, there's another firewall that we place between the VPN server and the LAN, and we do our access controls there. You can still do a level of security controls on the endpoint, but principally, you shouldn't rely entirely on them. Although I would argue, again, traffic filters on the endpoint are, because those are implemented in the WFP, the Windows filtering platform. So those are probably pretty stable, right? So if you implement traffic filters and say this is the only traffic that's going over the tunnel, it would be prohibitively difficult, if not impossible, for somebody, even with administrative access, to overcome that. But fundamentally speaking, they can create VPN profiles. So if an attacker conceivably had control of the endpoint, they would just look at that profile and go, oh, it's restricted because of this. Well, I'll just remove it and recreate my own without those restrictions. So you would still want to put those in place on premises for the most positive security.
So I think theoretically what you could do is use a standard tunnel for one and then a backup tunnel, potentially pointing at a second set of VPN servers, which would allow you to do all of that security.
There you go.
That's a boatload of work and effort, which unless you are in, well,
yeah,
I would say that there's probably better ways of answering what you're probably trying to do than trying to hack AOVPN to do it.
Yeah, I think ultimately it depends on the specific requirements, but yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions in here?
So we got one just mentioning, is the backup tunnel user initiated? Yes.
Yes.
So one of the features that we've actually brought to V3 is the ability to make the actual user tunnel user initiated or not. Most customers probably will never need to worry about that option, but the backup tunnel is always user initiated because one of the fundamental limitations of kind of the Windows platform and AOVPN is that you can only have one always on profile active at any one time.
Yeah, correct. If you were to make the backup tunnel always on, then whichever tunnel was provisioned last would be the always on tunnel, right? So you wouldn't have any way to deterministically control which one was which. You're right.
Which for most customers would be rather confusing.
I was gonna say it's really there mostly as a fail-safe. If in the event something goes sideways and you want your endpoints to be able to connect, and it's probably for help desk administrators and things like that. But then it's there, it's in the bank, right? It's there on the endpoint, and if you need it, you don't have to manually configure it. You can just run it and go for it. So.
Yeah, we do actually have one customer in healthcare. They want the two tunnels, one so that the primary one so that when they're at home, all of their healthcare traffic goes over the network. But when they're going to partner hospitals and things, they want to piggyback on the local site's access to the healthcare network. So they're using the backup tunnels and but then they're effectively training their users to say, hey, if you are at a NHS site, use the NHS enabled tunnel rather than the default, which in that very one specific scenario does allow or make a lot of sense from a configuration perspective.
Makes sense, yeah.
Maybe not so much for most others.
Very good, very good. Any other questions at all?
Doesn't look like it.
I think we're good to go.
Yeah. So just want to thank everyone for their time. We're going to have some useful resources, I think, either in the chat or will be in the chat soon. And I think there's also going to be an email out afterwards. If you want to contact kind of anyone from PowerOn about either DPC or AOVPN, anything like that, please reach out to us at info@poweronplatforms.com. And Mr. Hicks at rich@richardhicks.com.
Very easy. Yeah. Anyone has any questions at all about DPC or anything else, feel free to drop me a note. I'm always happy to answer questions. I can't promise that I'll get to them instantly. Sometimes my schedule gets busy and you may have a delay on replies, but I will get to you as soon as possible. And of course, you can find both Leo and I on Twitter. We're both on Twitter and active there. So look for us on Twitter. And of course, PowerOn Platforms is there as well. Use the hashtag AOVPN. That'll usually get you to the right people, and that's a great place to access some really good help as well.
Yep, always happy to give my 2 cents. Lovely. Well, thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.